Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It is the evening of the 1st of October 2024. It is 1946 in terms of hours of the 24-hour clock, and we are here today with the second live stream of the day, the first one being at 11 this morning on psychological warfare, and thanks to everybody who tuned in for that one. I'm aware that there are a lot of other events going on in the world right now, but I am loath to let the educational part of this channel slip. So we will be covering the Iranian response to US imperialism's assassinations of Ismail Haniyeh and Hassan Nasrallah. That'll be done tomorrow. For tonight, we are looking at this again, which is, of course, Stalin on the Opposition, our ongoing series until we've covered, well, all of this book, which might take us some time, but we are working our way through bit by bit. We're nearly about a third of the way through at the moment. So we'll get straight into it. Last week we covered Stalin's article in Pravda detailing the proceedings of the 14th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks. And we are here today talking about Stalin's response to the opposition contributions at the 14th Congress of the CPSU-B. And this took place between December the 18th and December the 31st, 1925. And this was a variety of oppositional figures are named in this text by Stalin. Trotsky is named only briefly, because we must always remember that the opposition was not just didn't just consist of Trotsky. There was also, and these are the two characters featured in this particular reply by Stalin. It also featured a lot of other people: Sokolnikov, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and ultimately Bukharin and people like that. So there was a variety of people involved with the opposition. It wasn't just Trotsky, even though the Trotskyites love to boil it down to just him. So he's not really mentioned that much in the in this particular contribution by Stalin. The discussion in this this response to the debate by Stalin focuses principally on the new economic policy, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, go back and watch the previous episodes in this series, and you'll be able to see how this comes up. But in brief, this was the introduction of elements of capitalism including foreign capital being brought into the Soviet Union in order to restart the economy. And Stalin spends quite a lot of time going back and forth with the contributions made by Zinoviev in criticism of the NEP. So this is 1925. The NEP was launched in 1921. So they're 4 years into the NEP. And the NEP comes to an end 1929 to 1930. And that's when, of course, the 5-year plans begin and mass industrialization begins. But before that, of course, they had to build up the economy to a basic level again. And you'll see as we go through this, one of Stalin's principal concerns, as was Lenin's principal concern, was maintaining and developing the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. Lenin and Stalin both understanding very well that if that alliance was broken, then the revolution was broken, because the Russian proletariat was a very powerful revolutionary force, but of course they were the minority in the country, which was still overwhelmingly a peasant country. And this necessitated an ongoing alliance with the small and the medium level layers in the peasantry, which Lenin was anxious to defend and develop. And this is part of the reason why the NEP was brought in, to be able to provide goods to the peasantry in the countryside and to be able to restart grain production on a more on a much bigger basis than had been done during the period of war communism, to come out of the period of shortages. So this is what keeps being debated in the CPSU-B all the way through the 1920s, with various different perspectives being put forward on it, including by tonight's largely forgotten men. I mean, Zinoviev and Kamenev are remembered principally for their ultimate fate in the Moscow trials, and it's a fate that was well deserved in the end. But we'll see here that Zinoviev was the longtime head of the party organization in Leningrad. And Leningrad became a center for all kinds of oppositional activity from the 20s all the way through to the late 40s. In fact, Stalin wrote his final work on the economic problems in the USSR in response to perspectives that were being put forward by economists who were active in Leningrad party circles at the time. So Leningrad was the center of the revolution, but then at various different times, the party organization there became sometimes ultra-left, sometimes opportunist. I think the problem came down to the fact that there were so many intellectuals who were slightly divorced from the workers, who were often in the leadership positions of the Leningrad party organization. It's no surprise that therefore that there was so much controversy generated by the Leningrad group. So the first point Stalin comes to is a debate with or debate on the perspectives of a comrade called Sokolnikov. And Sokolnikov is putting forward a point of view that is actually still kicking around in various forms to this day in modern day Russia. And what Stalin's responding to here is what he calls Sokolnikov's perspective regarding the doorsation of our country. Now, what Sokolnikov is putting forward, according to Stalin, is the idea that due to the fact that Germany is under the Dawes Plan. Now, if you don't know what the Dawes Plan is, it was a plan put forward by the U.S. financier Charles Dawes, who was later I believe he was vice president under Herbert Hoover. Dawes put forward a plan which would allow Germany to redevelop its industrial base in order that it could basically pay back its reparations at a later date once its economy had recovered. So the idea was that the US and the US imperialists would loan Germany a substantial sum. So the US would organize the loan of, according to, this is the State Department's website, I'm taking this from, because of course it was the State Department plan drawn up by Dawes. The US would organize a loan of $200 million to Germany to encourage economic stabilization. And this was, of course, something that JP Morgan floated on the US market, and the loan was quickly fulfilled by various private investors. So the US organized a $200 million loan to Germany to enable it to kickstart its industries again. The idea being that Germany would redevelop industrially and then would be able to pay off its reparations at a later date. So the more successful the German economy was, the greater the rate of reparations it would pay. Now, of course, this worked for about 4 years in total before the Wall Street crash comes. But what you notice is that under the Dawes Plan, the U.S. imperialists basically took over the economic structure of Germany, and Germany having been wrecked by the Versailles Treaty and the reparations and the chaos after the war, the U.S. imperialists then move in and start financing reindustrialization, as they would continue to do even during the period where the failed Austrian watercolor artist was in charge. So this is Germany essentially being bought out by U.S. imperialism, and U.S. imperialism taking over a large section of the management of Germany's debts. Now, how does this relate to the Soviet Union? And why is Stalin saying that this guy Sokolnikov is suggesting a Dawesation of the USSR? Because Sokolnikov was proposing that the focus of the USSR should be on accumulating capital rapidly, and that meant playing to the USSR's pre-existing strengths, meaning agricultural production, according to Sokolnikov. And his plan was that, well, Germany will be redeveloping its very powerful industries. But it will need food, and therefore the Soviet Union, in order to accumulate capital for later investments, should sell or focus on selling and exporting large amounts of food to Weimar era Germany, now undergoing a supposed industrial revival under the Dawes Plan. Now, Stalin responds to this in forceful terms. He accuses Sokolnikov of, as he says, wanting to do the Dawesation of Russia, of socialist Russia. And what Stalin responds with is worth quoting, because what he says that Sokolnikov is essentially tying or proposing to tie the Soviet Union to Germany, and to essentially keep the Soviet Union in a state of underdevelopment by proposing it serve as a site of essentially resource extraction. Notice that the Russian compradors made exactly the same, well, it would be charitable to call it a mistake, but try to do the same, roughly the same thing. Many years later, after the discovery of large oil deposits in across the republics of the Soviet Union, and gas deposits as well, the idea of the Russian compradors being that they would integrate themselves into Europe by selling large amounts of gas principally to Germany. Now, here is what Stalin had to say about that. And I'm going to quote you his response to Sokolnikov extensively here. Stalin says, "What does the Dawes Plan demand? It demands that Germany should pump out money for the payment of reparations from markets, chiefly our Soviet markets. What follows from this? From this it follows that Germany will supply us with equipment. We shall import it and export agricultural produce. We, i.e. our industry, will thus find itself tethered to Europe. That is precisely the basis of the Dawes Plan. Concerning that, I said in my report, insofar as it affects our country, the Dawes Plan is built on sand. Why? Because, I said, we have not the least desire to be converted into an agrarian country for the benefit of another country whatsoever, including Germany, because we ourselves will manufacture machinery and other means of production. The conversion of our country from an agrarian into an industrial country, able to produce the equipment it needs by its own efforts, that is the essence, the basis of our general line. We must so arrange things that the thoughts and strivings of our business executives are directed precisely towards this aspect, the aspect of transforming our country from one that imports equipment into one that manufactures the equipment. For that is the chief guarantee of the economic independence of our country. For that is the guarantee that our country will not be converted into an appendage of the capitalist countries. Sokolnikov refuses to understand this simple and obvious thing. They, the authors of the Dawes Plan, would like to restrict us to the manufacture of, say, calico. That is not enough for us, for we want to manufacture not only calico, but also the machinery needed for manufacturing calico. They would like to restrict ourselves to the manufacture of, say, automobiles, but that is not enough for us, for we want to manufacture not only automobiles, but also the machinery for making automobiles. They want to restrict us to the manufacture of say, shoes, but that is not enough for us. We want to manufacture not only shoes, but also the machinery for making shoes, and so on and so forth. That is the difference between the two general lines, and that is what Sokolnikov refuses to understand. To abandon our line means abandoning the tasks of socialist construction, means adopting the standpoint of the Dawesation of our country. So, that's rather a long quote, but I think the point is a strong one that Stalin's making there. And again, this is one that recurs throughout later Soviet and now Russian history, which is that there is a persistent tendency in the bourgeois, certainly, and in the Soviet officialdom, to chase what appears to be an easy answer. In the Soviet period, this is certainly true, which is that, and also chase an easy peace. Now, the easy peace in the 20s looked like that they could appease the imperialists by agreeing to become, essentially, as Stalin says there, integrated into or become an appendage of capitalism by being an agricultural supply base for German capitalism, because that's what Sokolnikov was proposing. And later, much later, in the 70s and in the 80s, many in the Soviet officialdom started to think exactly the same way about oil and gas, that this was a way to quick growth because you had the oil and gas right there. You could sell it right directly to Europe. And so this is one of the reasons they prioritized the Siberian pipeline and put so much effort into building that, because they thought it was a way to generate a lot of capital quickly, but also because they thought it was a way to secure peace with imperialism. That if you became imperialism's principal resource supplier, then imperialism would cease to be hostile to you. How incredibly and utterly wrong they were. But it's interesting there, what is Stalin insisting on? Let's remind ourselves. He is basically spelling out the things that the current government in Russia would have to relearn in terms of lessons almost 100 years later. So what is he saying? We don't just, well, the imperialists want to restrict us to the production of like one thing, so the manufacture of automobiles, but we don't just want that. We want to be able to produce not only automobiles, but also all the different stages of automobile production. So we want to focus on making the means of production that allow us to create the automobile, that allows us to create all the different elements that go into the supply chain of an automobile. You see the difference? The difference between having just a plant where an automobile or any form of manufactured good is prepared. So the various different parts are brought in and they're assembled in a factory and then exported out again. So you can have a car plant In fact, Britain has several car plants in it, but Britain has no car industry. Now, what happens is that Nissan and I believe Honda assemble cars here from parts made elsewhere, because they're given very advantageous conditions by the British government in return for them doing so. But the supply chain isn't based here. Some of it is, I think, but a lot of it is, of course, they're just bringing parts in from China, and then the cars are being assembled in Sunderland or in Swindon, and then the cars are being sold in Britain and Europe. So same is true in Germany now. In Germany now, a lot of automobile plants assemble cars from parts built elsewhere, a lot of them built in China. So to go back to Stalin's point, like the point he's driving home here is that the plan in the 1920s, the whole reason for the new economic policy is to get industrialization process going and to be able to attract foreign capital, to be able to develop certain manufacturing industries, but to also to use that foreign capital that's come in and to use the expertise that comes with it, to learn from it, to be able to strengthen the state sector, to be able to strengthen the cooperatives, to be able to strengthen the elements, the socialist elements in the economy. That's the purpose of it. Now, Sokolnikov, chasing an easy answer, thinks that you can just accumulate a lot of money by essentially integrating the Soviet Union into this Dawes plan for Europe, which is an American imperialist plan. And Stalin rejects that, saying, no, because the plan is to keep us deindustrialized and keep us poor. That was the role of that the Soviet Union was ascribed. Later on, it's the role that the Russian compradors tried to push capitalist Russia into as a resource appendage, principally of Germany. That was their way to making a fortune, and that eventually got derailed. Fast forward to 2007 and Putin's speech to the Munich Security Conference. What are some of the things that he's saying? Well, inadvertently, and probably not wanting to, he's ended up echoing certain points made by Stalin, if only he'd have learned from them much earlier in his life, which is that the Russian Federation now needs to essentially be strong enough to run its own industries, because what had happened to the Russian oil industry and the Russian gas industry in the 1990s was that so much of it had become dependent upon a supply chain that was not within Russia itself. So, for instance, to run an effective oil extraction site, to run an oil drilling operation, to run a gas extraction operation, you need a lot of machinery. You need a lot, and you need to be able to replace that machinery when it wears out. Now, what happened in Russia in the 90s was a lot of the machinery, the production facilities to make the machine tools that maintain the oil and gas industry, a lot of that was destroyed, asset stripped, shit canned, to use the Americanism. And they ended up having to buy in parts for their oil and gas machinery from Germany, from France, from the United States, and from Britain. So the Russian compradors ended up undoing 70 years of industrial development inside a decade. And Putin and the Russian government started to address that after around about 2007, when they started exercising more and more control over the oil and gas industry. But it's worth remembering that this idea that if they just the various comprador elements and the reactionary revisionist elements in the Soviet Union, this idea that they had, that if they could just turn the Soviet Union into an appendage of the capitalists, into an appendage of Germany, that it would lead to peace and mutual development. Well, that was a stupid idea in the 1920s and a treacherous one, and then it kept coming up, because again, it's a tempting prospect for those who chase easy answers. And then, unfortunately, it was the Russian working class who had to pay the price of the compradors pursuing that. So, worth reflecting upon that. And then Stalin moves on to talk about there's a back and forth with Lev Kamenev over concessions to the peasants, which is a bit of a repetition of what we've gone through before, but I'll just summarize it here. He goes back and forth with Kamenev over Kamenev and Zinoviev are alleging that too many concessions have been made to the middle peasants. Stalin essentially argues that the alliance with the middle peasantry had to be solidified, and that therefore the provision of consumer goods to the middle peasantry under the new economic policy was justified, and that the priority was to build up that alliance with the small and the medium peasants. And Kamenev and Zinoviev, who's always swung back and forth on this question. Like, if you notice that the line taken by the oppositional figures in the 1920s constantly goes back and forth. Like, there's not a single consistent one amongst them. Trotsky went wildly back and forth. Zinoviev and Kamenev went wildly back and forth, before Trotsky hit upon just striking an ultra-leftist pose at all times. But all of them vacillated when it came to the big questions. And so Kamenev accuses the Central Committee of making too many concessions to the middle peasants. Stalin rejoins that, replies to that by saying, well, we are indeed making some concessions to the middle peasantry, but this is for the purpose of building the alliance, on securing the alliance between the proletariat and these lower layers of the peasantry. So the other points that I wanted to draw upon, to elucidate further upon, relates to the NEP. Now, here we get into a debate, and bear in mind this is 1925, between Stalin and Lenin's widow, Krupskaya, who was talking about what is the nature of the NEP, and she said it was state capitalism. Stalin has an interesting reply to that, which I will quote to you. And it reads as follows. But to say that the NEP is capitalism, that is nonsense, utter nonsense. The new economic policy is a special policy of the proletarian state aimed at permitting capitalism, while the commanding positions are held by the proletarian state, aimed at a struggle between the capitalist and the socialist elements, aimed at increasing the role of the socialist elements to the detriment of the capitalist elements, aimed at the victory of the socialist elements over the capitalist elements, aimed at the abolition of classes and the building of the foundations of a socialist economy. Whoever fails to understand this transitional dual nature of the NEP departs from Leninism. If the NEP were capitalism, then NEP Russia that Lenin spoke about would be capitalist Russia. But is present-day Russia a capitalist country, not a country that is in transition from capitalism to socialism? Why then did Lenin not simply say capitalist Russia will be socialist Russia, but preferred a different formula? NEP Russia will become socialist Russia. So, worth just pausing there to reflect on what he's saying. The purpose of the NEP was to, by temporarily making some concessions to capitalism, to use that to strengthen the socialist elements. How? Well, first of all, you use the economic activity that's been built up via the reintroduction of capitalist methods to strengthen the proletariat in the cities. You use it to strengthen the proletarian alliance with, as I previously said, the middle peasantry and the lower peasantry, and you use the expanded industrial production that's been brought about by the attraction of foreign capital to direct resources into the development of the state sector and to the strengthening of the state sector. All of this was done, and all of this was done at the same time, of course, as the proletarian dictatorship was in fact strengthened, not weakened, and that the power of the proletariat in Soviet society increased. It did not decrease. The power of the proletariat inside the party increased. It did not decrease. And so, yes, you can. They introduced certain capitalist elements for a few years. In fact, it ran for 8 years, 21 to 29. But in doing so, every element of growth that was generated by those concessions, sometimes to foreign capital, was used to strengthen the industrial sector that was controlled by the state and strengthen the rule of the workers in alliance with the small and medium peasants, and used to increase the power of the workers both economically and politically. So it was not used to disempower the working class, to push the working class out of its role as the rulers of society. It was not used to dilute and destroy proletarian power inside the party itself, and it was not used to strengthen the rule of capital or to restore the rule of capital in Russia. That is not what was done. And so to call it capitalism would be incorrect. Now, and of course, a temporary measure that lasted 8 years. So the point then moves on, and we move on to discuss further issues regarding mistakes made by Bukharin, and Stalin talks further about the preservation of the bond between the Soviet power, i.e. the proletariat, and the peasantry. But then he draws upon something quite interesting, which is the work by Lenin in Can the Bolsheviks Retain State Power? And the interesting thing he quotes here is something that I'm just going to read to you because I think it's worthy of further consideration. This is something from Lenin that Stalin is quoting from an essay in 1917. Lenin said in 1917, "The big banks," referring to the big banks of the imperialist nations, "are the state apparatus we need for bringing about socialism, and which we take ready-made from capitalism. Our task here is merely to lop off what capitalistically distorts this excellent apparatus, to make it still bigger, still more democratic, still more all-embracing. Quantity will be transformed into quality. A single state bank, the biggest of the biggest, with branches in every volost, in every factory, will already be 9/10 of the socialist apparatus. That will be nationwide bookkeeping, nationwide accounting of the production and distribution of goods. That will be, so to speak, something in the nature of the skeleton of socialist society." So, the point that Lenin is making there is an interesting one, because when you consider the power of the banks now in Britain, in the United States, and a lot of other places, like given how many assets they control and the fact that they're practically merged with the state anyway, taking over all the giant banks and turning them into one state bank would go a long way towards actually essentially wiping out the power of the capitalist class in a place like Britain, where the banks really are everything and they are effectively merged with the state. So what you would need to do, well, one of the things you would need to do when establishing the proletarian state is take that over, merge it all into one bank, and then seize all the assets controlled by the banking oligopoly in this country or in the United States. So if you got a workers' government in the United States, you could very legitimately, of course, seize control over the banking sector and control a gigantic section of the economy via the assets that banking sector already had. It's an interesting point made by Lenin that's worth remembering there. Now, Stalin then goes on to talk about the NEP some more in opposition to Sokolnikov, but we've already covered the essentials of that. There's then a discussion of Zinoviev going back and forth on the question of the peasants, and I've already mentioned this, so I'll just say in passing that the thing you notice about the oppositionists is that they all take, as I said previously, these wild swings back and forth between different perspectives, especially on the question of relations with the peasantry. And this is what this is one of the big issues that Trotsky has. And again, like Trotsky's consistent hostility to the middle and poor peasants is notable, and Zinoviev swinging back and forth between saying at one point that the middle peasantry should be annihilated or eliminated, and that the alliance with them is crucial. So what is Zinoviev's actual position is the response that Stalin makes there, and goes on to criticize the waverings of Zinoviev. So furthermore, a couple of interesting points to note here. This section 9 in this response, he says, concerning disagreements in the party, he notes that in 1924, the Leningrad comrades themselves actually favored the full expulsion of Trotsky from the party, and that this was actually the majority of the Central Committee rejected that position, opposed it, and and Stalin actually says, we disagreed with Zinoviev and Kamenev, who were the ones suggesting Trotsky's expulsion, by the way, in 1924, because we knew that the policy of amputation was fraught with dangers for the party, that the method of amputation, the method of bloodletting, and they demanded blood, was dangerous, infectious. Today you amputate one limb, tomorrow another, the day after a third. What will we have left in the party? So it's interesting that Stalin, condemned as the man who, purged everybody from the party at this stage, is actually taking a more moderate position than Zinoviev and Kamenev, who first of all demanded Trotsky's expulsion from the party, then 2 years later were in an alliance with him. The two of them swung wildly between back and forth. Now, here we get to an interesting historical detail. I remember reading many years ago, when I first got into Trotskyism, thanks to a book by Tariq Ali, if any of you remember him, where he was describing that the awful man Stalin was in alliance with the awful man at the time, Bukharin, who went before a conference of peasants and told them to enrich themselves. Now, I remember that because I've never did any reading into what was the context of what Bukharin said, and was that actually the Soviet policy at all? Now, it turns out it wasn't, and what Stalin says here is quite interesting, because he says the following. Next, the question of Bukharin. I have in mind the slogan, enrich yourselves. I have in mind the speech delivered in April when he let slip the phrase, enrich yourselves. 2 days later, the April conference of our party opened. It was I who, in the conference presidium, in the presence of Sokolnikov, Zinoviev, Kamenev and Kalinin, stated that the slogan, enrich yourselves, was not our slogan. I do not remember Bukharin making any rejoinder to that protest. When Comrade Larin asked for the floor at the conference to speak against Bukharin, I think it was Zinoviev who then demanded that no speeches be permitted against Bukharin. However, after that, Comrade Krupskaya sent an article against Bukharin demanding that it be published. Bukharin, of course, gave tit for tat and in his turn wrote an article against Krupskaya. The majority on the Central Committee decided not to publish any discussion articles not to open the discussion and to call on Bukharin to state in the press that the slogan "Enrich yourselves" was a mistake. So, to go back over this, what's portrayed as by the Trotskyists as Stalin's alliance with Bukharin leading to Bukharin being able to declare a policy whereby the peasants and the kulaks were instructed to enrich themselves. This is something which is a gross misrepresentation of history. What actually happens was that Bukharin does talk shit and did say that, but was immediately rebuked by the Central Committee and forced to repudiate his comments. And then the Central Committee basically said, well, the controversy ends here, and we're not going to continue it by publishing hit pieces from senior party members against each other in the press. So they didn't publish Krupskaya's denunciation of Bukharin, but nor did they publish Bukharin's denunciation of Krupskaya. So seems like a small thing, but in small things, big decisions lie. So Bukharin did say "enrich yourselves." It probably was his point of view, given that he later defended the continuation of the new economic policy and was in favour of more and more pro-capitalist measures being taken. But again, that wasn't the official party position. Bukharin was going outside of party policy and was immediately rebuked for doing so. So that's an interesting thing that Stalin comes out with there, and Bukharin had to repudiate his own comments. So the overwhelming reason why this is something which is worth reading, why the proceedings from the fourth conference of the CPSU-B are still interesting, is because of these debates around the new economic policy, around the alliance with the peasantry, which of course is so incredibly important to understand, and also about the nature of, well, how the Soviet Union was going to relate to, if at all, the imperialist world, economically speaking, and the priority for the Soviet government, which was consistently about being able to not just produce commodities, but being able to produce means of production, which was an absolutely crucial part of the NEP, and then came to be a central part of the later 5-year plans. And again, like, it defies the conventional explanations of the 1920s by both the Trotskyites and the bourgeois historians, bourgeois so-called historians, in reality propagandists. So yes, interesting stuff. Probably, I think what I'll probably do in future when we get to these congressional things is, because the two articles I've done both this week and last were actually shorter than they looked. When it comes to these congressional questions, I'll probably just lump in all of the congressional documents together when we do another program related to them. So like everything from like the next Congress, we'll just take all in one show. So that's the end of the discussion of the document for this week. I'm going to go now to the comments. So we have 164 of you watching, so if you haven't liked and shared the stream, be sure to do so. Hello to Penguin and Grassy Knoll and to Albert. Glad you're enjoying the program. Greetings to Svetlana in Moscow. Hello to you, comrade. Tom Jode, hello to you, and hello to Krasovets. Svetlana, apparently somebody's trying to steal your identity on YouTube. That's a bit fucking weird. Is it a NAFO creature? Sounds like the sort of thing that they'd do. We'll certainly keep an eye out if it pops up here. Good evening to Comrade Ian Foster and Jerry, and more time needed from Skeggy on the English Riviera, and Vato and Dave. Need a translated playlist of the Soviet classics, apparently. I'll have a look at doing that. Good evening to Jawad and to Lars and to Fantomas and to Peter from Perfidious Albion, of course. BWP, good evening to you. Tim Gray, good evening to you. Davey, hello to you. We've also got David King. We've also got TG Wilson in the comments. And we have Jenny, hello to you. And good evening, or good afternoon, I should say. So we've also got Abtin. Greetings to you up there in the wasteland of NATO-occupied Sweden. And Penguin says alone. is buying £100 for £110, which is an obvious con. A loan from an imperialist is built on quicksand. Yeah, and you get stuck in it very quickly. T.G. Wilson says Charles Dawes was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1925 for the Dawes Plan. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? Jenny says never tried to appease the imperialists, and that's correct. Jerry says, especially a land as vast as the USSR with such rich resources can be totally self-sufficient. Indeed, it could be. Tim says, so much of the early history of the Soviet Union is unknown. These kind of talks are vital to fill in the blanks and refute Western propaganda. Well, this is the reason why we're doing this show. Hello to Victor the Van. Penguin says, I kind of expected the IMF to make loans to many nations post-COVID. Maybe they did. I need to track that down. I'm not sure about it at the moment. Victor says, I made a post about this in how Putin admitted that Russia will have to hop back onto the socialist train. Yeah, he's made a lot of noises about that. And to be fair, like the developmentalist state that has ultimately been built there they've had to reject an awful lot of the legacies of the 90s and the 80s, going back to rejecting some of the stuff from the later Gorbachev period as well. T.G. Wilson says the IMF, World Bank, Global Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, and the US Foreign Aid Program were a formal system of the political implementation of American hegemony. Very true. Yet the burden of inter-allied debt imposed by the United States compelled the governments of Europe, allies of the United States, to impoverish their national treasures, to run deeper and deeper into debt, to deprive their industries of needed credits, to limit their export potentials, and to leave a clear field for the United States to grow as a world power. That's a quote from Michael Hudson. Well, yes, and on that, Hudson is broadly correct, even if I do disagree with him on numerous other points. Greetings to Lurtis from Perfidious Albion. T.G. Wilson says, even Keynes derided the state loans. Quote, that a comparable system between governments on a far vaster and definitely oppressive scale represented by no real assets and less closely associated with the property system is natural and reasonable and in conformity with human nature. Tariq Ali is indeed a champagne socialist. Yes. Yes, and T.G. Wilson's making a point about NATO being there to control Europe. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's there for many different reasons. I mean, we talked on this morning's stream about the usage of NATO to suppress the domestic working class, that being the principal thing. To militarily threaten the USSR and the people's democracies of the East, that's another usage of it. But ultimately, it's so that it's a means also by which the US imperialists control their supposedly allied nations. The imperialists there's this great cartoon from the Soviet magazine Crocodile from like 1951, where it's got all the NATO countries sat on bar stools, each of them shaking hands with each other with one hand and soaring through each other's bar stools with the other, which sums up the relationship between the imperialists perfectly. They'll all unite against the working class. They'll all unite against any socialist country. But they'll all be constantly trying to undermine each other, with the US as the biggest and the ugliest of the lot, usually being the most successful at ripping off the others. I mean, just look at what they did with Japan, with the Plaza Accords, I think it was 85, deliberately getting the Japanese to basically sabotage their own economic development. Which is essentially what they kept demanding that the Chinese do, with regard to the convertibility of the renminbi. They were trying to do another version of the Plaza Accords and do them against China, and the Chinese kept basically telling them to fuck off. And why would they go along with that? Luis Gomez, red salute to you in Portugal. Hello to Richard Madden. Hello to Guy in Brazil. Edward says, my friend is afraid that NATO will start a full war on Russia. She even sees dreams about it and woke up at night. How can I calm her, and what arguments are there against a NATO-started hot war? The biggest argument against a NATO-started hot war against Russia is to examine what the industrial capacity of the European countries is, and the United States. That's the biggest argument against it. Look at the state of the US industrial base. Can that actually go accelerate itself, expand itself to the level of production that will be necessary to sustain a full-blown war with Russia? Can they do that within the next 6 months, within the next year? The answer is no, they can't. Look at also the size of the US Army. Can they expand that rapidly in order to fight the Russians before this Ukraine war is over? No, they can't. This is the reason why they're slowly backing away from this. The plan is, as I've said before, to keep the war going and keep Ukrainians dying in large numbers, but to avoid a direct confrontation themselves, or an open and acknowledged confrontation. Victor says, every time I hear Gorbachev, I think of Pizza Hut. Yeah. I mean, Pizza Express would have been a more appropriate company for him to choose, but I guess, he was taking any gig that came back then. Greetings to Alistair from Prague. Any comment on Iran strikes on Israel? It will be commenting on that tomorrow, Alistair, if you'll care to join us again then. Richard asks, what will it take for the YouTube left to realise social democracy is dead? Them no longer making money off selling bullshit to idiots. Yeah, I'm being rather uncharitable there, of course. Look, the reason why, like, various commenters on YouTube and elsewhere still keep trying to sell the social democratic lie is because, let's be fair, some of them will still believe it. That's rather hard to believe, but yes, they do. Some of them, it's cynical because they know on some level that this is lowest common denominator stuff. This is like lowest common denominator stuff on the left is, see, if I wanted to chase more views as a leftist YouTuber, what I would have to do is probably cry a lot more and make videos where I show, like, I don't know, a rundown school in Britain or something, and then say, but Britain's the 5th richest country in the world. Are you telling me they can't afford schools? Or something like that. Something which, plays on the emotions and fundamentally doesn't explain anything. That's what like most like leftist YouTubers do. Because again, emotional manipulation, not explaining anything, throwing figures around, and again without explaining like why is the Britain the 6th largest economy in the world? What's that based on? Is it based on manufacture of commodities? No. Is it based on a phenomenally successful export economy? No. Then where's the money coming from? What makes Britain the 6th largest economy in the world? Is it our magnificent scientific and technological research base? Well, there's a certain amount of that, but it's not, 6th biggest economy in the world standards. It's not China level. It's not even US level. So what is it? What is it that makes Britain the 6th biggest economy in the world? Who wants to deal with that question? Nobody. Well, very few people. And that is because if you start investigating, well, where is what is the driver of profits of the biggest British corporations? What are the biggest British corporations? Some of them are in oil. Some of them are in mining. A lot of them, though, are banks and finance houses that make their money by moving it around the world. Not money commodity to money, but money to money, to quote Marx. The reason why the stock dems won't get into that is because then you've got to talk seriously about imperialism. And you've got to talk seriously about, well, where did all the money come from the period that they most admire, which is whether you're British or American. It's like the period from, in American terms, New Deal era, Roosevelt period, through to Johnson in the middle 60s. Where did the money come from all that? For all that came from basically the successes of American imperialism. the American imperialism successfully, as was indicated in the early debate about the Dawes Plan, successfully replacing Britain and France as the premier imperial power in the world and deriving an awful lot of profit from that. In the British case, our social democratic period was financed by the hyper-exploitation of the colonized world. So if you're a social democrat, you don't want to deal with all of that, because then you've got to face facts that your beloved social democracy was funded by the robbery of the colonized world. And it was never going towards socialism in the first place. So it is for these people who run these social democratic channels, they don't want to get into any of that. They just want to say, oh, we're a rich country. You're telling me we can't afford program X, Y, and Z? You know? And again, that has a certain appeal, has a certain sell. It's not what I'm interested in doing, which is why I'm not sat here doing videos telling you how good the Green Party is, because that will be bullshit. So the social democratic sort of media personalities, especially the bigger ones like, you know, norovirus media, Scam Cedar in the United States, etc. You know, Chapo Nepotism House. They just want to sell you the idea that, you know, voting hard enough in one particular direction is going to restore some social democracy. They'll flip between that, like councils of despair, and dismissing the population as just too stupid. And that's why their media projects are designed to lead you absolutely nowhere. Norovirus media is basically designed to disempower their own audience, to leave them feeling hopeless, or to lead them back to Saint Jeremy of Islington, who will, like a prophet, lead them out of the desert and into the promised land. Of course he won't, because he's involved with a project which is ultimately run by British deep state freaks. So there's a lot of mileage in selling people bullshit, basically. And the Social Democrats will sell people a gigantic pile of bullshit. Okay. So, going back to comments there. More time needed says Gorbachev asked a little boy in Pizza Hut what was his pizza like. The boy answered, "It tastes of counter-revolution, you traitor." In another version of that advert, the boy pulled out a pistol and shot Gorbachev. Alistair says, "I'm so embarrassed that I was a subscriber to Chapo for a while." Well, you know, happens to us all. I used to listen to their stuff as well. Absolutely. Basically, like, didn't it come out that most of those guys were like connected? Like the lead guy, what's his name, Menaka? Isn't like his dad like something big in publishing or something? And like that creepy fucker, what was his name? Virgil, not his real name. He's like the brother of a Republican policy advisor. They're both named Cass. That's their real name. That's Virgil. It's his real name. His surname is Cass, and Oren Cass is his brother. And Oren Cass was an advisor to, I think, Ron DeSantis at one point. So I mean, that's who those guys were. They're still around, but they're from like elite families. And maybe they took a sort of left turn in a legitimate way, but to pretend that they were these guys, you know, what was it they used to call them, dirtbag left, that they were like these sort of scuzzy bastards who came out of nowhere. No, most of them were like guys who had a pre-established family connection to media or to money, and that's how they were able to do it, basically. And where did the money come from all those social programs in the Nordic countries they love so much? Well, to answer Jenny's point, in Sweden, a lot of it came from doing deals with the Nazis. In Finland, I think, did Finland get included in like the US reconstruction plans after World War II? I think they did. In Norway, it comes from oil. But also, Sweden definitely is a big exporter of capital. Like Sweden is a smaller scale imperialist power. Yes, they're in the American bloc, but they do export capital to developing world nations for the purposes of hyper-exploitation. Sweden does have a significant finance capital element to it. Just the same way a lot of other European countries do. Denmark does as well. These are all smaller scale imperialist powers. And again, Social Democrats do not want to talk about that. Penguin says, the book on the city, often recommended here, said that 4 trillion moves through the city of London every day. Totally insane when the impoverished East End is a stone's throw away. Very true. T.G. Wilson tells, I think, what is an old joke, but it's a good one. When it says, when I was a kid getting a new bike, Jerry Adams walked in and said, you know, you need a license for that. And I said, yes, a provisional one. Tsh. Otis says, according to the latest Rumble post from the New Atlas, Britain admits they're out of arms since last year as West attempts to prolong the Ukraine war. I don't know about out, but certainly, like, I think that they've burnt through whatever stockpiles that they had left over. They've been giving Ukraine, like, not just like modern stuff, but they've been basically dumping all the old crap on it as well that they can't use anywhere else. In Latvia, among people, this is from Edward, who see through nationalist pro-West garbage, people are infiltrated by the idea that nothing can change and stop the current comprador elite. Well, these are the next stages that people are going through. More people wake up to the fact that the current ruling group are utter shite and need to be got rid of, but then people don't believe that anything could happen to uproot them. Comprador rule in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, I mean, I don't know this, but my speculation is it's a lot more insecure than it looks. They are there basically through the inertia of the Baltic masses and through the residual anti-communism, anti-Russian sentiment. They're not there because anybody in the working class particularly likes them. They are a fragile elite who were imposed there post-1989 and systematically lied to people to get themselves into the positions that they are. Chicken Pot Pie says Britain is just an international pirate at this point. Yeah, that's true. Jenny, with reference to Chapo, says they could be funny at times. Yeah, they had their moments. I mean, they were funniest when they were just talking about TV programs. Cumtown was better, though. Yeah, Nick from Cumtown is a genuinely good comedian. Even Adam Friedland has his moments. Grassy Knoll says, if you listen to FDR's second Bill of Rights speech, he sounds pretty progressive. Yeah, and that never went anywhere, did it? Lertis says, Finland declined the US debt trap on account of neutrality. Not for much longer, as it turns out. But yes, in the aftermath of World War II, they were, of course, up until recently, they weren't in NATO. Edward says, that's why the Latvian comprador elite is in power. Well, it's also why the British ruling class is still around. It's like, yeah, they probably have more loyalty to them amongst the petty bourgeois than is true in the Baltic states. But the reason why they're still there is inertia. The reason why they're still there is because, like, the working class just hasn't got its act together yet. That's why. Rista Costadino says, when I started to listen to Cumtown, I stopped finding most comedians funny. Most comedians aren't funny. I mean, there's been a so-called stand-up boom in Britain for like the last 20 years, and it's just produced embarrassing dog shit. It really has. Like, utter crap in terms of actual jokes. Just guys who go on and, like, you know, have I got news for you, and pull a soy face, you know. That's the extent of comedy in Britain now. It produced John fucking Oliver. What do you expect? Right, okay. So I'm going to draw things to a conclusion here for today. I'll be back next week with another excerpt from the book. I think we're going to be doing a longer one next week. It's going to be concerning questions of Leninism, which is longer than this week's one. So you can find that in on the Marxist Internet Archive or in the Stalin Collected Works editions, which you can find on the Marx 2 Mao site. So yes, come back next week for concerning questions of Leninism, and we will continue our analysis of the work of Stalin on the opposition. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in today. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Audio uploads of today's 2 programs will be on there shortly. Thanks to all of you who've tuned in and who have contributed to the chat for this evening. And yes, to answer Jenny's question, it's very easy to cancel Netflix. Right. Thanks again for tuning in. Back with you again tomorrow for all the latest from West Asia. Until then, though, thank you and good night.
Zde Praha, československé zahraniční vysílání.
Peasantry,